Welcome to Broad Eye, the podcast that explores knowledge gaps in ophthalmology and eye care.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to another episode of the Broad Eye Ophthalmology podcast. Like today, it's quite special because we have a guest host as well, like Dr. Rubens Belfort. How's it going?
Hey, Bruno. Great to be here. It's an honor to be here on Dr. Singh's participation on your podcast. Thank you for the invitation.
So yes, we do have an illustrious guest today. Give him a background in oncology. I'm a big fan of him. Dr. Arun Singh, thank you very much for accepting the invitation and being here to chat with us today.
Oh, it's a privilege also. Thank you.
All right. So despite all your knowledge, like in the field of oncology, like today we're going to talk about something different. Your other passion, which is like scientific publishing. So could you tell us a little bit, how and when did you get involved in it, and what exactly is your role within the scientific publishing industry?
So I've been in this publishing business for a while. My first paper, I remember, was published in 1990. So this is 30 years now. And the few things that are important is writing is not just about trying to write about anything that you see, but it's also, I think it's important about learning and increasing your own knowledge. The best way really to improve your knowledge is to try to write something, and in the process you have to educate yourself, and you tend to read very deeply, very broadly. And so that's the best way to improve your knowledge, is to write.
And you're the editor-in-chief of the British Journal of Ophthalmology, is that right?
Yeah, so that was some years ago. I was co-editor-in-chief with Dr. Dua for almost 7 years. And that was a very busy time. That was the chief editorship. And after that, we started our own journal here in oncology, which is ocular oncology and pathology, for which I'm the editor with Dr. Hans Grosniklaus from Emory, and he's a pathologist, as you all know.
Very good, very good. So, Dr. Singh, when we think about the scientific industry, the peer review process is very important, right? Could you please tell us a little bit of your impression on the peer review process as it is today, and why it's important for science?
So peer review process, as the name indicates, is a review by your peers. Peers are people who are knowledgeable about the topic, who are in the same field, and are in some ways also competing with you because they're in the same sphere. And smaller the field, more is this tension or the competition, because there are only so many people and we tend to know each other. In a bigger field, say like cataract and refractive surgery, there'll be thousands and thousands of authors and there'll be so many reviewers, and so they tend to become more anonymous and more generous. In smaller fields, peers can be, although we say we have no conflict of interest, but inherently there is. And there is a clear bias, which is a disadvantage to the author, because in majority of the journals, the review process, or the peers who review your article, are anonymous. We don't know who they are. But obviously they know who you are as an author. So it's like an asymmetry of information. One side knows who the other is and the other one doesn't know. And in this cloud of anonymity, or behind this shadow, sometimes the peer review process is not as positive or as desirable or as fair as it should be. And I think that's the role of the editor, to realize or have some sense that this is an unfair criticism. So there's a limitation with the peer review process. But at the same time, if you try to say, well, we should have an open review process, that is, we know who the reviewer is, then it's very likely that the review may also therefore be more positive, because nobody wants to criticize somebody on their face. Particularly a junior faculty to a senior professor may not want to write harsh criticism of a useless paper. even if written by a famous ophthalmologist. So there are some advantages and disadvantages, but most of the time, peer review process is a one-sided process where they are kept blinded or anonymous.
That is very good. I never thought of it on that way. It's very interesting.
And one of the flaws, right, or criticisms of the peer review system, of course, nothing's perfect, is that, like, because the reviewer knows who the author is, there might be a system where like an inside network where, like, let's say, like, I mean, we know each other, and then I happen to be the review of your paper, and I'm going to give a favorable review, and then if you receive and you're the reviewer of my paper, then you're going to be favorable in my review. On the other hand, if, let's say, someone that is not so known in the community, they might not receive like such a favorable like a review. Like my point is, like, I mean, is it a system where, like, I mean, the who might matter more than it should than the content of the paper itself?
So in the ideal world, everything should be fair, but it's not, because we all have biases. And biases can even extend to like countries and regions and people and names and institutions. Just to give an example, or the way the English is written, somebody writes a paper from some small town in India or some remote university in Brazil, and there's another paper from Harvard, just to give a name, of the same topic. The reviewer just inherently is more biased to accept a paper from Harvard than from, say, a small town in Brazil, for that matter. And same thing translates to how famous the author is. More famous the author is, very likely they'll get away with bad quality papers. And so it perpetuates. More you become famous, it's more easy for you to write bad papers, because you are not held to that high standard where a novice author is. So these are human biases, and we can only try to overcome, but I don't think we can. And so therefore people are trying to do like some kind of a AI-based system where the review is they have break it down into components. Is it a novel idea? Is it a well-done study? Is it a large study? So they break down into 20 components and assess the paper more objectively, rather than my assessment, oh, it's a good paper. So there are companies, and one of which is in Switzerland, who's trying to do this kind of process where they are trying to take it away from being subjective to being more objective.
So, well, Dr. Singh, you already mentioned it. So not only big institutions end up having some facilities or easier ways of getting published, but we could also say that researchers affiliated with large institutions have easier access to data, and also may have a better review from a colleague. Do you think the peer review system in that way reinforce elitism? Is it a club that is very hard to get in, but once you're in a big institution, it makes it easier for you?
Yeah, so there is. So if you get into a big university, you have a lot more resources, a lot more money, better quality data, information, maybe even more rare conditions, more new technology, bigger companies more likely to come to you with the new instruments. So you have these inherent advantages. And it's just that, if you're born in a rich family, you have certain advantages. Okay, you can define them, because if your father is rich, he's very likely to marry a beautiful woman. So there you go, you're naturally handsome. And if you're handsome, you are more attractive, and therefore you have some social success. And it goes on and on and on. So same way, working in a privileged institution, not necessarily big, but a high quality or higher respected or more advanced institution, certainly imparts all the advantages to you. So yes, there is a club, and therefore all these old journals, if you look at all the editors, where are they coming from? They're coming from those institutions. Who are in editorial board? They're all from these institutions, and therefore they control the playing field. I mean, that's just what it is. You look up any journal and you look up any editor, and you'll find that they are from these places.
Dr. Singh, another flaw, right, of the peer review system is how long it takes, right? So let's say if you have a data and then you send it to a journal, it might take months, until that paper is available for the scientific community. And because of that and other reasons, there's been a growth of non-peer-reviewed platforms where researchers can share their data, and that is sometimes inserts into scientific journals, like supplements, or releases on blogs or personal websites, or even podcasts like this one. So the question is, is there any credibility to the non-peer review system? Does it have a place in the scientific industry?
It's like anything else. We are evolving to a more open and equitable society, and therefore this peer review process, which is tilted away from an average ordinary author, will also diminish to some extent. But it's like old traditions, it's there. There's power and influence, and that's not going to disappear very easily. And all these alternatives that you mentioned, particularly there are these sites where you can pre-publish your paper, and that does not stop you from publishing in a peer-reviewed journal later on. So you have a good study, you think it's innovative, it's novel, you can deposit it in this repository, and you can claim to be the first person to do that. This is a registration that you did this because you published it online, and then you can refine it, polish it, adjust it to the requirements of the journal, and publish it. And so this model is very common in other fields, not just of medicine, but other fields where sometimes they can take 1 year for peer review. But in ophthalmology, let's say, we say 1 month, 4 weeks, 6 weeks, is most of the journals will turn around papers in 3 to 4 weeks. But still, if you want to claim novelty or claim some innovative, then you can do this kind of deposit into a site. So I think that's a good way. It really is.
Very interesting. Dr. Singh, why does it cost so much to download a paper? If we take into consideration people that are not in a big institution, especially in North America or in Europe, usually the private hospitals, sometimes even the public institutions in other countries won't allow the physicians or scientists to access the paper, and we have to pay for it. If we consider that the reviewers, authors, sometimes editors, and if you print it online, even printing is free, why is it so expensive?
So the cost really is of making this PDF and layout, etc. So when you submit an article, somebody has to make sure that everything is correct in terms of content, all the references are correct, the figures are correct. You don't say figure 1 and figure 1 is missing, for example. So those kind of editing and copy editing process to make a PDF, which is complete and total, takes certain time and money. So the money is actually for that. Secondly, all these publishing companies are for profit, so they have to make some profit from the journals. And if you say I go to an alternative model where I want free access, then they charge the author to pay for it. So either the author can pay money and publish the article and it's free to everybody, or you can make it free for the author, which generally is, and then you charge the reader to pay for it. These are the two models. There isn't a third model where it is free for the author and free for the reader. Yeah, you can make a journal if you have some kind of endowment, then you say I have this millions of dollars, and I will run this journal and it's free to everybody. But there is certain inherent costs, and the costs are as a production, basically, and some profit. But there is real cost. I mean, plus they archive the material, they host the material, they make it searchable. You can go back and find it. It's archived. Those kind of things. So there is some cost in all that.
So Dr. Singh, I mean, we all know that if you want to find a paper, we go on PubMed, right? So that's where all search start. It's very rare that we go in the page of a journal and start looking for a manuscript, unless, of course, we know that the manuscript was published there. But even then, all searches will probably start on PubMed anyway. So I understand that once upon a time, before the internet, specific journals were needed because they would cater to specific societies or specialized fields and so on. But now, you find a paper on PubMed, regardless of which journal is it at. Is there a rationale to eventually eliminate completely the journals and just have one repository of scientific publications?
So the answer is, to some extent, yes. It's good to have all the articles available and then you can choose for yourself. But then when you have so many articles, it's very difficult to choose which is better quality and which is not so good based upon the scientific content and the methodology. So journals, especially high quality journals, do good evaluation of statistical methods, validity, biases, other things inherently that can be present in the paper to assess for that. So those are the advantages of reading an article from a high quality journal versus an article that is just self-published, because you do not know, or average reader cannot tell, these statistical methods and other things in the paper, whether they're right or wrong. So that's the one advantage, I think, of a high quality journal.
All right, so you kind of guide the researcher, right, when they're finding the papers. If he knows the journal where it's coming from, it's sort of like a stamp of quality, right? So
that's right, yeah.
So taking a turn here, and then we talked already about the cost of accessing those publications, and it's just prohibitive for a huge chunk of researchers worldwide, particularly the people that are from developing countries that do not have institutions that sign for having universal access to all that data. And because of that, that's been the explosive growth of platforms where people can find those papers for free, and it's not exactly legal. It's kind of like Sci-Hub or LibGen. So I just wanted your view on this phenomenon and how the traditional scientific publishing industry sees it. Is there any way to quantify the damage that it does?
So these platforms, how do they harm the traditional industry?
Yeah. That would be a way of summarizing the question. Yeah.
So like everything else, I think they're complementary. They have their own market and they have their own audience. Whereas other people, for example, the traditional models, people in that, so there are different populations and different readerships and different regions, and they will continue to flock in their own ways for a long time. So there'll be some inroads from this democratic system, let's say, trying to get into the elite system, but it's going to take time.
Okay, very interesting. And so, Dr. Singh, what do you think can be done to make access to scientific information more universal?
I think there is already some move in this direction, and one of them would be of differential pricing. So when people go from different parts of the world, developing nations or low-income countries, let's put it that way, then when they try to access an article from Elsevier or other websites, then maybe they should be charged less money based upon where you're coming from. So differential. So there are sites where that will happen, or some journals will do that. So that's one way. Second is that if a study is supported by a grant, which some of them are in the US and UK and other countries in Europe, then these articles are free access. So suppose I have a study funded by the US government, then they are almost always free access because the government insists that you make it free access. So the author may pay to the publisher some money to make it free to everybody. So there are some system movement in this regard going on. But the third thing really I would say would be private endowments, etc., for them to start their own journals. Say, for example, there are big endowments in Brazil, and you say, okay, we have Brazilian Journal of Ophthalmology, etc., but you can have another journal where it's free and the cost is kept minimal, either by donations. People can just donate some money and say, I take $10 and I take this article. And the rest of it is managed through some donations from the endowment, and even drug companies support, for example. So you raise money for a conference, but you raise money for a journal. And you have, every year, you kind of have some money to run it. So that is just like any other system. You can do crowdfunding for a journal, and there's nothing wrong in that.
Yeah, Dr. Singh, I think I agree with everything you said. I think there's a role for everyone in the field, and things continue to evolve. The point was not to just trash the peer-reviewed scientific system. I'm a fan also. I published me in Buddhist, in many papers, and I think that's it. Like dialogue, right? See the problems and I keep fixing them, like research.
But yeah, before we finish, I would want to point out that peer review system has good intentions, and it works well if everybody plays it correctly. So the author submits the paper in all earnest that he'll get fair treatment, and the reviewers may reject the paper, and that's okay, as long as they write fair criticism. This is the flaw, this is the fault, this is the flaw, etc., etc., etc. So there is some learning in the process. The author will then read them, and if he can change it or accommodate, he will, to improve it. Or if there is a certain flaw he learned from his methods, the next time he does the research, he will not do that. So there is this process of learning in all of this, which is a positive way it should be. But also, like we talked about, there are negative things, and we kind of mentioned those. But I do want to point out that the intention is great, and I think it's impendent upon all of us to be fair and equitable, like in our personal lives, also in academic lives.
Yeah, I agree. Albeit not perfect, it's still the best system we have. So.
Yes.
All right, so I'd like to wrap this up by thanking you again. It was a pleasure to chat with you. I would like to thank Dr. Rubens Belfort for being the guest host of this episode. You're a good friend of mine, so it's always good to connect and spend some time together.
All right. Thank you, Bruno. Thank you, Rubens, for inviting me. It's a pleasure to talk to you both and to meet you and see you guys. Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Singh.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
And that concludes today's episode of the Broad Eye Podcast. If you enjoyed this episode, please be sure to subscribe on your favorite podcast platform. Of course, ratings and reviews are always welcome. And you can certainly share this episode with any of your colleagues or friends who might enjoy it. Thanks for listening.